Good afternoon. Our next speaker is Carolyn Pierini. She's a clinical lab scientist and microbiologist with over 20 years hospital experience in hospital labs, particularly in the microbiology department, but also chemistry, hematology, and immunology. Her area of specialty is nutrigenomics, which is an area of functional medicine using blood and urine chemistry to identify food, lifestyle, and environmental factors as major determinants of health status. She's an investigator, author, lecturer, technical consultant, formulator, and educator. Her investigations into the causes of ill health have naturally led her into teaching the foundational role of nitrous oxide in human health. Today, she's going to talk about the vital role of the oral cavity in successful production of nitric oxide and the recycling of nitric oxide. Welcome, Carolyn.
Thank you. Thank you.
For the handshake.
Thank you. Thank you, Lori. In the spirit of disclosure, the AGD disclaimer, I am the clinical science director of Neogenis Labs, and we do have a booth here out close to the door. Okay, so I'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so today I'm going to do a review of nitric oxide. For some of you, it is a review. For others, this may be the first time you're hearing about nitric oxide. And then I'm going to get into the main part of the topic, and then I'm going to talk about ways that we can maintain or improve our nitric oxide levels. So what is nitric oxide? It's actually a newly discovered molecule. This is a new field of science, so we're all learning together. It was just discovered in the 1980s. And primarily, first and foremost, it's a cell signaling molecule. And that means it's a biological messenger, but not in the way that we used to think. This little tiny molecule doesn't need a receptor. It's just one nitrogen and one oxygen. And what it does, it rapidly penetrates. It just darts through cell membranes. Like I said, it doesn't need a receptor. And it has a very short half-life of just a couple seconds. And that's because it reacts so quickly with its target molecules, which could be a carbohydrate, or a fat, or a protein, like an enzyme, or it could be the iron center of hemoglobin, or it could be the sulfur center of glutathione, or it could be a free radical. It can switch over to being an antioxidant because it can donate an electron. It can also neutralize a free radical. So it also reacts with water. So this kind of changed our whole concept of cell messaging. And because it was so significant, it was awarded a Nobel Prize in Medicine and Physiology in 1998. And that actually was the shortest period of time between a discovery and the awarding of a prize, because the discovery was so significant. So this is a molecule that virtually influences every part of our physiology. It regulates the cardiovascular system. Now, this is where its prime importance is, because cardiovascular disease remains the #1 killer of humans worldwide. We're going to talk more about that. But as we study nitric oxide, and it is the most heavily studied molecule in all of the medical literature right now, we're learning that it is our innate immune system, that immune cells produce nitric oxide. And it's important for inflammatory balance. It's important in cell energetics. Constant aha moments about what this molecule does. In cellular energetics, we find out that it's regulating our mitochondria. It's actually stimulating our stem cells from the bone marrow or wherever, and it's directing them to where they need to be in the body so that they can cause regeneration. We also know that it is a neurotransmitter, so it's very active in the nervous system. Not like the neurotransmitters, maybe acetylcholine or serotonin, but an NANC neurotransmitter, non-adrenergic, non-cholinergic. And it's very important for our GI function, the health of the gastrointestinal tract, and interestingly enough, all of our metabolism. So I'll give you some more information on all of these as we go along. The fact is, this discovery has already affected millions, and it has the power to transform the way we practice medicine in this country and worldwide, and it's going to affect the health of many millions more. So I think all of us can agree in here that diet and exercise remain the two main lifestyle habits that have been shown to influence the risk for chronic disease. But why? Because we know that good or bad, these factors are actually impacting our nitric oxide production. There's mounting evidence that this single abnormality, the inability to produce nitric oxide, is the earliest step in the development of common chronic diseases that we see in our patients every day. So there's an absolute need for continuous production of nitric oxide. It's still true, a man is as old as his blood vessels, and that's because there's a vascular component to chronic disease. And the heart of this is endothelial dysfunction. Now we define endothelial dysfunction as a nitric oxide deficiency. It's the condition of lost nitric oxide bioavailability, and it's central to cardiovascular disease. And as you'll see as I go on, that the loss of nitric oxide is both the cause and the result of endothelial dysfunction. Any disturbance in the bioavailability the availability of nitric oxide leads to a loss of cardioprotective regulation and leaves us susceptible to disease and increases disease progression. So how do we make NO? The human body has actually two endogenous pathways that we know of. The first pathway was discovered with the discovery of nitric oxide, and that is the L-arginine pathway. So if you know anything about nitric oxide, you're probably thinking L-arginine. So that pathway actually uses the substrate L-arginine, but it is nitric oxide produced by enzymes in our body called nitric oxide synthases. And those enzymes can be found in the endothelium, for example, in our nervous system, and a little bit different twist on that enzyme can be found in our immune cells. We're not going to talk about that one very much today because it's regulated quite differently than what we call our constitutive or our physiological production of nitric oxide, which is mainly seen through our endothelial cells and in our nervous system. So, L-arginine is captured as the substrate, and using these enzymes, the NO synthase enzymes, we yield nitric oxide and L-citrulline, which is then further recycled back to L-arginine. So it's not like we need copious amounts of L-arginine. Our body really should be recycling L-arginine. This pathway is complex and complicated. It depends on oxygen and cofactors. And some of those cofactors can be missing in one of your patients, or there's a genetic predisposition to having low cofactors. So we have another pathway. And actually, this secondary pathway is going to be the main pathway I'm talking about today as it impacts you as dentists. This pathway has been called different names: the secondary pathway, the alternative pathway, the additional pathway, but nonetheless, it's just as important as the L-arginine pathway. Recycling pathway is what I like to call it, or maintenance pathway. This pathway depends on nitrate, and that nitrate is actually being supplied because, or from, the fact that nitric oxide production in the L-arginine pathway gives us nitric oxide that performs its signaling function, and then what happens to it? It actually gets oxidized to the anion nitrate, and that nitrate builds up in the bloodstream. And that nitrate then will actually be converted to nitrite and into nitric oxide, and I'll cover that. This is the mechanism also for the cardioprotective benefits of diets such as the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet. The reason vegetables such as green leafy spinach, kale, arugula, even celery and beets are so cardioprotective is because they contain high amounts of nitrate. The importance of this pathway can be seen at birth because breast milk contains very high levels of nitrate and nitrite. And those anions are being converted to nitric oxide, acting as the innate immune system in a newborn. This pathway is not oxygen dependent. As a matter of fact, when you have small dips in oxygen levels throughout the day, depending on where your health is or if you're exercising rigorously, you're going to activate this pathway. It gets more robust when it senses hypoxia in the body. And this is how we protect ourselves. We can make nitric oxide in a good oxygen level and when oxygen starts to deplete. So these two pathways work in concert. They keep our nitric oxide homeostasis happy. They keep nitric oxide levels physiologic so that all the functions that nitric oxide is involved with are working right. So let's talk about some of the things that nitric oxide does. And what I tell you today will be different next year because we will discover new things that nitric oxide is involved with. This has been the missing molecule. As I start talking more about it, you're going to see, aha, that's been the piece we've kind of been missing all along. So, nitric oxide is the main molecule for vasodilation and blood flow. How important is that? Well, it's all important because it's bringing oxygen to the tissues, it's bringing nutrients, it's bringing water. It is supporting the extracellular matrix. It is picking up toxins from cells and taking them back. So we have to have proper circulation in order to have proper health. All health starts with blood. It starts right here. And this is the main factor for getting that blood. And it's anti-atherogenic. It actually inhibits vascular plaque. And it does so for these reasons. It's antithrombotic. It's actually telling the platelets how to behave. Don't get too sticky. Don't stick together. It's controlling platelet regulation. It decreases blood pressure because it's allowing for vasodilation. And it's preventing that vasoconstriction. It controls endothelial permeability and vascular inflammation. It's inhibiting the expression of adhesion molecules on the endothelium. Remember, the endothelium is that single cell layer that is the blood vessel lining in all the blood vessels of our body, including our lymphatics. So if it starts expressing molecules, sticky molecules, then it's going to attract white blood cells and platelets to that surface. When that happens, those can pass right through the membrane, we call it transmigration, and start that process of inflammation that eventually leads to plaque. So it inhibits the white cell adhesion and migration into the endothelium. And it inhibits smooth muscle proliferation that's associated with arterial stiffness. So it can act, as I said, as an antioxidant. It's involved in host defense. The immune cells will produce huge amounts of nitric oxide in an effort to kill all types of microorganisms, whether they are bacteria or fungi or parasites, even viruses. It also kills rapidly dividing cancer cells. It regulates our mitochondrial function, and it actually causes us to create more mitochondria. It stimulates mitochondrial biogenesis. It's critical to sexual function. It causes the vasodilation that leads to blood engorgement in the sexual organs. And it acts as a neurotransmitter to innervate erectile tissue. It's a neurotransmitter, like I said, throughout the brain. Last summer, a study showed how it inhibits beta amyloid plaque in Alzheimer's. And here's my favorite. It activates the GLUT4 transport system of glucose into the cell. Now, any of you who have ever worked with patients trying to lower their insulin resistance, you know that this is a challenge. And little did we know when I went to school, we were told insulin stimulates the cell to pull up glucose, right? Insulin's doing all the heavy lifting. This is how it actually happens, and this was shown in a study last summer also. Insulin is a signaling molecule for nitric oxide, for those enzymes that I talked about. So once nitric oxide is produced in the cell, it is actually activating by hitting the sulfur targets on the GLUT4 transport to activate that system so it can go up to the cell membrane and pull glucose into the cell. We were missing this really important step. Insulin is signaling for nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is controlling glucose metabolism. Tissue homeostasis. It's protecting us from hypoxia, and animal studies have shown that if you have enough nitric oxide potential in your body, if you were to sustain a heart attack, you would not have tissue damage. And that's because it starts to regulate the mitochondria in a low oxygen state. And of course, it regulates the gastrointestinal tract. Okay, what you're looking at right here, let's see if I can get it to work. It actually should have happened automatically, but I'm showing you right now, this is a vascular bed. This is actually intravascular microscopy, and we're looking at a blood vessel that is not getting enough nitric oxide. And everything I was just describing, you're going to be able to see. Let's see if I can get it to work. Oops. Darn. This was working when we tested it. Let's see. Sorry? No. Yeah, I do. We hit play right there. I really want you guys to see this. Otherwise, I wouldn't force him to do this right now. I love these little videos. Oh, it's right here. It was all set up for me when I came up. Oh, okay. No, we changed it to my name. Okay.
And underneath there is and then you have something that also doesn't.
Yeah, it didn't show up.
But there is in our presentation. Yeah.
It worked. Okay. Well, so what we're looking at right there is a blood vessel, like I said, that doesn't get enough nitric oxide. And if you can see, the white blood cells are adhering to the endothelium. Some of them have actually passed through the endothelial wall and membrane. And you can see that the blood vessel is constricted a bit. There it goes. All right, look at the activity of the white blood cells. That's not normal. They should be honing around the endothelium nice, smoothly. That vessel's constricted. You don't see a dark color because there's not that much blood passing through it. But if you if you put nitric oxide gas directly in the lumen of that blood vessel, watch the activity change. There it is. That's a blood vessel with nitric oxide regulation. Those white blood cells are not sticking to the endothelial wall. They're doing their honing along it because they're looking for injury. Look how wide that vessel is and how dark, because it has more blood flow. This is what you want throughout your whole body, all the vascular beds of your body. You need nitric oxide regulation to prevent endothelial damage, endothelial dysfunction. Thank you. Don't you think those are cool videos, though? I need visuals. Okay, thank you so much. All right, so let's look at our, yeah, give them a round. So let's look at our first pathway, the L-arginine pathway. So everything above that red line is the way it should be working, and everything below is in a disease state. And you'll see L-arginine being used as a substrate, and all the cofactors above, tetrahydrobiopterin, some vitamin B2 and 3 derivatives. We need heme, glutathione, oxygen, calcium calmodulin. If any of those are in short supply, or if your patient is in a state of high oxidative stress and inflammation, and some of those cofactors become oxidized, you're going to see the situation below. But before I get there, do you see how NO is being recycled into NO2, which is nitrite, and then to NO3, which is nitrate, and then again to nitrite. That's a perfect system. We're producing NO through our nitric oxide synthase enzymes, and that nitric oxide is performing its function, and then the body's very thrifty. It's going to recycle that nitric oxide through nitrate and nitrite to become nitric oxide again. That's what gives us our 100%. Below, when these enzymes are exposed to any of these factors, like reduced oxygen, or reduced cofactor in substrate, or oxidative stress, those enzymes can become uncoupled. That's the worst thing that can happen to an enzyme system. In that scenario, L-arginine now is being put through the enzyme, but what you get on the other end, instead of nitric oxide, is superoxide, one of the worst free radicals in the cardiovascular system. So, we want to work on getting the healthy production of nitric oxide back. If endothelial dysfunction, you're going to see what's below the line there in disease. So this is a better pictorial. This is the part I really want you to get. This is your blood vessel. So the red up there is the blood passing through the blood lumen, or the vessel lumen. There's your endothelium. Below it is the basement membrane, and below that is the smooth muscle that actually allows your blood vessels to dilate and constrict. So what we have is shear stress is represented by the mechanical force that's being put against your blood vessel wall, and that's really the main stimulant for the production of nitric oxide. It gets even better when we exercise. So if we can increase shear stress, we're actually giving our body the message to make more nitric oxide. So you can see that L-arginine is being converted into nitric oxide with citrulline as a byproduct and then recycled back to L-arginine. So nitric oxide, once it's produced, it's a little gas that permeates membranes. It's going to permeate into the smooth muscle, cause muscle relaxation. It's going to get into the lumen of the blood vessel and regulate all that white cell and platelet activity. By the way, it's also telling your bone marrow to produce the stem cells, the progenitor cells that are going to repair the endothelium. And you can see this reaction down here. Nitric oxide actually stimulates, one of its targets is an enzyme here that's going to turn on a secondary messenger leading to relaxation. And this is where erectile dysfunction drugs actually work. Many people think erectile dysfunction drugs produce nitric oxide. They do not. They work downstream of healthy nitric oxide production. And you don't often hear that these drugs, they don't work in 50% of people because you have to have enough nitric oxide to cause enough vasodilation for these drugs to work. These drugs are actually inhibiting the inhibitors of that vasodilation. So essentially, they're causing the switch for vasodilation to stay on. And that's where you get the danger of a 4-hour erection when you're using a drug like nitroglycerin. Okay, here's the problem. 4 independent studies by the American Heart Association are telling us that by age 40 in this country, people have already lost 50% of their nitric oxide production. Women tend to go a little longer, and that's because of the protective effect of estrogen, because it turns out that testosterone and estrogens are signaling molecules for nitric oxide. They have other functions too, but they signal for nitric oxide. So the longer we can keep these hormones, the better our nitric oxide levels can be, provided our enzymes are not dysfunctional. So what we're trying to do is shift this curve to the right. We want to take a longer time before we start losing nitric oxide or not lose it at all. Okay, so now we're going to get it more into the nitrate to nitrite to NO pathway. So over the last decade, we've discovered the cardioprotective benefits, like I said, of certain diets and physical exercise. They're promoting nitric oxide production through different pathways. So foods such as green leafy vegetables and beets contain the high amounts of nitrates that can be reduced to nitrite and nitric oxide in the mouth and in the gut. And there have been many studies demonstrating NO activity from these foods. The problem is that not everybody experiences the same benefits from eating the same types of foods. Why? It starts here with the nitrogen cycle. This is all we knew at one time. We know that there's plenty of nitrogen in the atmosphere, but that nitrogen needs to be fixed by lightning and by bacteria in the soil into nitrate so that the plants can uptake the nitrate. We eat the plants, we get the nitrate. So maybe this will help a little bit more. So nitrate from diet is consumed, and the nitrate is extracted. It enters the bloodstream. And the salivary gland is going to preferentially, it's going to actively, I should say, take up this nitrate from the blood and put it into the mouth. And here's where I really want you to get that. This is really so much of what I'm trying to teach you here, is that the mouth is so important for this process because nitrate must be reduced to nitrite. But we don't have the enzymes to do that. We need a nitrate reductase enzyme. That enzyme is provided to us through our commensal bacteria of the mouth. Not all the bacteria, but certain ones. There happens to be facultative anaerobic bacteria, some of them are strict anaerobes, that live in the crypts of the tongue, on the dorsal side of the tongue. And we depend on those bacteria for conversion of nitrate to nitrite. That's the main purpose of nitrate, to be converted to nitrite. Nitrite's what we're really looking for, because it's one reduction away from nitric oxide. And we store nitrite in our body. That's how we store nitric oxide potential. So, nitrite in the saliva starts to build up then. As this nitrate is reduced, nitrite's being formed and it's building up in our saliva. And we're swallowing saliva all day long. Nitrite, in the presence of acid, will convert to nitric oxide. So when we swallow that saliva and it hits the stomach acid, boom, get a big production of nitric oxide. Recycled from the L-arginine pathway, but also fortified through a diet that's also providing nitrate. So you can see that nitrate's coming from two places, meeting up in the blood, and then it's passing through the mouth. And this is the main process. We call it the enteral salivary nitrate to nitrite to NO pathway. Okay, a little bit closer look. Those little drops are nitrite coming from that mouth, and it's entering into the stomach acid, and it's becoming nitric oxide. And that nitric oxide is doing a couple things there. It is joining forces with the hydrochloric acid to kill foodborne organisms. So effective are the two of them together that they will kill hemorrhagic E. coli. They'll kill Candida albicans, they'll Salmonella, Shigella species, even the spores from Clostridium botulinum. It also is creating vasodilation in the stomach. That's going to relax the smooth muscle, which is necessary to accommodate a meal, so we get stomach distension. Many patients complain that I can't eat very much because I get too full too easily. My stomach doesn't seem to expand, or food sits in my stomach, it's not moving through. We need nitric oxide's presence in order to distend the stomach, to churn the food, and to cause that movement down towards the small intestine, the pyloric cap. So we need that action, but I love this part. It stimulates the mucus that becomes the mucosal membrane. That mucosa that lines our GI tract is supported by nitric oxide. And GI problems today are very prevalent. So another way to look at it, up there you see nitrate from diet, nitrate from the blood that's existing. Let me see if I can use this laser. It hits the oral cavity, becomes nitrite, which is swallowed into the stomach, becomes nitric oxide, which is regulating the gastrointestinal tract. Some of that nitrite, though, is also getting back into the blood and tissues where it's stored, which later on, if the body senses any drop in oxygen tension, is readily going to convert to nitric oxide. So let's, again, this pathway. It provides bioactive NO and may become the major pathway as we age. It depends on the bacteria that have the enzyme we need. This is creating symbiosis between the bacteria and us, the host. So, convincing evidence is shown, and now there's a few more studies that have shown that the use of antiseptic mouthwash or the chronic use of antibiotics that destroy the intestinal bacteria affect our NO pathways, our production in this pathway. So Scientists are now thinking that as much as 30 to 50% of the population may be impacted by this. The crucial importance of nitrate is reduction to nitrite, which is carried out by the oral microflora. This becomes a new area of study and possibly regulation. So there exist these bacterial communities that provide the human body with this constant supply of nitrite. This is contributing to optimal cardiovascular health. We know the absence of these bacteria affects our nitric oxide homeostasis. And so maybe individuals who are deficient in these commensal bacteria would be, benefited by restoration of those bacteria, protecting their cardiovascular system. So we know that most bacteria will reduce nitrate all the way down to elemental nitrogen. But what if we can cut off, or what if we can find bacterial populations that only have nitrate reductase, so we can build higher levels of nitrite. And that way, when we swallow that, we're producing nitric oxide in the stomach. That's the goal here. So here's a study that came out this year that's trying to identify these communities of bacterium. And they were able to find quite a few of them, actually. And most of the activity is right there on the dorsal side of the tongue. These aren't all the bacteria in the mouth. So the short-term goal of a study like this is really to identify these bacteria. And it's interesting because I get asked all the time, what about the probiotic that I'm taking from my gut? Is that going to help my, oral flora? And the answer to that is probably not, because it turns out that lactobacilli, which is found in most of those probiotics on the market, all different kind of species of that genus lactobacilli, are the groups that have shown the worst nitrate reductase activity contain the most amount of lactobacillus. Now, we're not saying that lactobacillus is a problem in the mouth necessarily, but it's either genetically not capable of producing enough nitrate reductase enzyme, or it's releasing some kind of substance that might be inhibiting that enzyme activity. So the take-home of what I'm just saying here is probably not a good idea to be using your GI probiotic for your mouth, at least until we know more. So what disrupts this pathway? Well, we're not eating enough foods that are rich in nitrate, like our green leafy vegetables. Or there's a rare problems with nitrate uptake from the blood. Or you have patients who don't produce enough saliva. That's not giving enough medium for this nitrate to concentrate in. And of course, the oral commensal bacteria, but insufficient stomach acid. So, we don't get better at producing stomach acid as we age. It's interesting because the same statistic is around age 40, we're only producing half the amount of stomach acid that we produced when we're younger. But we need to have stomach acid to complete this nitric oxide production. So, the third most commonly used drug in this country are PPIs, proton pump inhibitors, or some form of acid blocking or reducing drug. This is disastrous for nitric oxide levels. Not only is it not providing the acid medium to make nitric oxide, but actually PPIs in that category. A study came out again last summer that showed that PPIs are actually inhibiting both pathways. They're actually inhibiting our nitric oxide synthase enzymes, and they're blocking the secondary pathway. And so the study showed that, why are these patients have increased risk for cardiovascular disease? They were mainly looking at the nitric oxide synthase enzymes, but we also know that it's affecting this pathway. So it's very important to educate your patients on that. And of course, increased oxidative stress. We could be producing nitric oxide, but if your patient has so much inflammation in their body that they're forcing nitric oxide from its signaling role into its antioxidant role, we're going to lose our nitric oxide. This is the oral systemic link. Disruption of nitrite, and thus NO, in the oral cavity likely contributes to the link between oral hygiene and cardiovascular risk and disease. I have a lot of references at the end. You can check it, read more about these. So NO supports oral health. It supports oral health in many ways. Oral health supports nitric oxide, but nitric oxide supports oral health. First of all, it's bringing more blood and circulation to the gums of your patients. And that's what's going to create the healthy environment that's going to sustain that balance in the oral microbiome so that we don't have overgrowth of the opportunistic bacteria, which can become then pathogenic. It's also providing the extracellular matrix, which depends on circulation, to get that to work right, which has fibroblasts in it, which are responsible for collagen deposition, so you can build a framework for proper healing when you have to do procedures on your patient's gums. So nitric oxide is contributing to the health of the gums. There's also some action in the mouth with, if there's so much karyogenic bacteria in there that the pH of the saliva is constantly dropping, if we can get more nitrite production in the mouth, again, nitrite converts in an acid environment to nitric oxide. We'll have some of the support of nitric oxide in helping to balance those bacteria. So there's widespread evidence that NO deficiency in the population is serious and it's growing. It's what's driving the escalating rate of morbidity and mortality that's financially plaguing the healthcare industry. Consider the fact that most of the symptoms of low nitric oxide are the focus of therapy in healthcare. This focus needs to shift to the underlying problem. NO is a fundamental core molecule to all human function, without which optimal health is not possible. Therefore, NO needs to be a primary consideration in evaluating the health of all your patients. Linus Pauling said, well, he advocated a healthcare system based on providing the right molecules in the right amounts at the right places. He indicated that the right molecules are substances that are normally present in the human body. It is not just the fact that our patients aren't eating the right diet or they're not exercising. There are many factors that they don't have control over. There are environmental influences all around us. We're being hit with 80,000 high-risk chemicals every single day. We're just beginning to uncover the impact on nitric oxide. Your patients may have genetic polymorphisms. Maybe they don't produce enough of the cofactor that they need. There are all kinds of influences we haven't even considered yet. We know this, though. We should be making more nitric oxide in our body. And cardiovascular disease, the rate of it is not getting better, it's getting worse. So our conclusion here is that there's profound effects of nitric oxide in health and disease. Recognizing nitric oxide insufficiency is critical for disease prevention. Many medical practices and pharmaceuticals also disrupt NO production and may be responsible for many side effects. Implementing lifestyle modification and strategies, of course, is important. And diet and moderate exercise as part of a healthy lifestyle are key to maintaining NO bioavailability. But what we're learning is that the endothelium heals better, faster, actually has a chance to be restored when we can give it nitric oxide. There are substances called nitric oxide donors. And the reason that's so important is because if you give the body nitric oxide first, you have the benefits such as telling the bone marrow to release the stem cells that we need to fix that endothelium, because it just doesn't, the adjacent cell where there's damage just doesn't divide and fill in that space. That's not how it works. So we need the stem cells. That means we need nitric oxide first. That means we have to put a mask on before we can start really seeing and implementing change in the body. There's many products that claim to be supporting nitric oxide production, but you can't just give more L-arginine to somebody who has severe endothelial dysfunction. That's tantamount to putting gas in a car that has a broken engine. What we have to do is fix these enzyme systems. And the one way you can do that is to actually use nitric oxide gas itself. So it's very important to get nitric oxide, to help bring nitric oxide production back. And here's the list of some additional reading if you're so interested. And I thank you very much for your time. Okay, I don't know if I make it.